Hello, Internet! This episode of Full Frontal Developer, we're going to be working on a project called Progress Bars. Surely you've seen some flashy web content and wondered to yourself, how is that created? With only a few lines of code and a few simple files, this can be done by almost anybody. These videos are best suited for people that have some basic understanding of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and may have even dabbled in it. But if this is a complete mystery to you, these videos may be a little bit too fast-paced to your liking. Alternatively, if you have intermediate or advanced experience in these technologies, these videos may be too rudimentary for you. And so this is best targeted for people that just have a basic understanding of what this is and what it's used for. So that being said, we're going to dive right in. We'll start by going into Visual Studio, which is a perfect application for doing front-end design. And I have here the three obligatory files needed for the web page design. It's going to be the index.html for the body, the script.js for the functionality, and the style.css for the styling. So we can go ahead and open up the index.html, and we'll start by laying out the body. I'm going to go ahead and open up a browser, and using Live Server, we're going to be able to keep track of our web page content as we're building it so we can see how it works. Right now, obviously, we have nothing. So in the index.html, since this is an HTML5 document, we're going to declare that with the doc type declaration right here. We'll open up an HTML tag and set the language equal to English, like so. Within that, we'll go ahead and define a head tag. And in the head tag, we'll have a couple of meta tags. The first one is going to define the character set equal to UTF-8, which is just a nice round character set, perfect for making sure that all of the characters are transcoded correctly. The next meta, we're going to define a viewport. And we're going to set the content of the viewport equal to the width of whatever device it's being looked at from. So whether it's a phone, a laptop, or a big screen TV, it's all going to look nice and pretty, and the scale is going to be set to 0. So we'll set the content equal to the width equal to the device width, and the initial scale will be set to 1. And that'll take care of all of our meta tags. Next, we're going to need to provide a link to the style sheet, so that'll be done so. And we have that reference as being style.css. After that, we'll go ahead and give it a title. We'll call this one Progress Bars, or Progress Steps. And that'll take care of everything in the head tag. Next, we can jump in the body, and in the body we'll define a main div that we'll call as a class container. And inside that div, we'll have a subdiv that we'll call as class progress container. Inside the progress container class, we are going to have an empty div that we're going to call progress, and we're going to ID it as progress so that we can access it from the CSS and the JavaScript. And this is just going to be an empty div, and it's going to represent the progress bar that we're going to have filling up. After that, we're going to have a div that we'll call as class circle. And since we're going to need to have some number of active circles, we'll start with the first one being active, because in progress steps, usually the first step is innately active. And we'll have that as circle 1. After that, we'll copy and paste that a couple times. Let's give our progress steps 4 circles. So we'll have 4 steps in this progress. And we only need the first one to be active, because we're going to advance through. And as we advance through, the progressive circles will be active. That'll be the end of that div. We'll go ahead and declare a couple of button elements, and we'll classify them as btn and ID them as next and previous. The next one we're going to set to be disabled, because on step 1 you can't really progress any earlier than step 1, so the previous button is going to be initially disabled. But we'll give it the title of previous, and then we'll copy and paste that so we can make a button that we're going to call next. This one will be previous. And next. This one does not need to be disabled because we actually do need to be able to advance to the next state. So we'll call that one next. And that takes care of all of our buttons. Now outside of that div, but within the body tag, we'll go ahead and define the script. And we know the source is going to be our script.js. And the reason that we define this outside of, or at the end of the content, is so that it doesn't interfere with the rendering of the content on the screen. We don't want it to be laggy. And so that looks good for our index.html. We'll go ahead and open that up and see what it looks like. Nothing very impressive right now, just a column of numbers, an inactive previous button, and an active next button that has absolutely no functionality. So definitely nothing to impress with right now. But if we jump into our style.css, we can change that. The first thing that I want to do is direct you over to fonts.google.com, where you're free to pick out a nice little font. For this project, I've gone with Oswald, and we can copy and paste the import annotation like so. And I'm going to paste that into my style sheet, and that'll give us access to that nice font. And following that, we're going to define some root variables for the CSS document, and this is essentially going to be our color palette. If you go to color.adobe.com, in the color wheel section, you'll be able to find this wonderful tool where you can create all sorts of different color palettes with all sorts of different color types: analogous, monochromatic, triad, split complementary. I mean, this is really an incredible tool. I could spend hours just playing around with this, and you can essentially design yourself a color palette, and it will give you the hexadecimal value that CSS will be looking for. And so just a fun little tool, a nice little resource for web page development. I've already pre-selected the color palette that I'm going to be using for this one, but feel free to pick one of your own. So we're going to define the main background color first, and this is going to be equal to the color 1C, 1A, 17, which is just a nice dark gray. After that, I'm going to do a line border empty. This is going to be the color of our progress bar when it is not filled. And for this one, I've decided to go with DECB, B6, which is going to be just a nice desaturated orange. And then after that, we're going to define the line border fill. And for this one, we're going to do CCA61B, and that should be a little bit brighter of an orange there. Next, we're going to define the circle background color. So circle BG color, and we'll set that equal to just a simple white. And then we'll do the circle text color, and this is going to be set to a nice gray. Then we're going to do a button background color. This will be set to the same nice bright orange, like so. And then we'll do a button text color active. So whenever the buttons are active, it will be set to a basic gray, a nice dark gray, and then whenever the buttons are inactive, the text color inactive will be set to a lighter gray, like so. Alright, so that takes care of the root variables that are essentially going to be our color palette for this project. Moving forward, we're going to declare a universal styling using the asterisk, and this is going to simply set it to a box sizing of border box, and that's going to keep all of our elements nice and tidy. Then we're going to define the entire body design, which is going to be a background color. As we've discussed, we're going to use var to access the main background color, like so. After that, we're going to do the font family. As we've seen, we're going to make sure that we import the Oswald, and we can do sans serif, like so. After that, we're going to make sure that we have display set to flex so that everything floats nice and tidy in the middle. And anytime we do that, we need to align items to the center, and we need to justify content to the center. We'll give it a height equal to 100% of whatever the view height is, and we'll give it an overflow of hidden so that we don't see any scroll bars, and we're initially going to set the margin equal to 0 so that we can set a margin as we please for each individual item. Alright, so that's as it stands right now. We've got something a little bit nicer looking here, however we're not quite finished with the styling. So moving forward, let's go ahead and begin to style the main container object. This one will be pretty straightforward. The container is just going to have a text align of center, and that's all we need. So we save that. We see we've got those numbers now in the center. Let's go ahead and define the style for the progress container within the container. And that's going to be a display equal to flex so that everything floats nice and tidy in the middle. Of course, justify content. We're going to do space between, and that's going to make the numbers fill up all of the space in between their border box. The position is going to be relative, but then later on we're going to do some absolute positioning. The margin bottom we'll set to 30 pixels, and then we'll do a max width of 100% because we don't want it to go off the screen, but then we'll do an initial width of, we'll say 350 pixels. Alright, that takes care of all of that. So now we have something coming into shape that looks like it might be a progress bar or progress steps. After the progress container, we'll go ahead and define a state of the progress container that we're going to call before. So we'll do progress container and give it the state of before. And anytime we do something like this, we need to always include some content. And although we don't need any content, we'll simply throw it in there with some empty single quotes just so that it's there, so that it actually works. We'll do the background color. Background color is going to be equal to the line border empty because we initially want it to be empty. And we'll do a position of absolute, which is going to be a top of 50% and a left of 0. Then we're going to transform it because it's going to be a little bit too close to the bottom. So we'll do a transform. We're going to translate y, so on the y-axis, and we're going to pull that up by 50%. So we'll use negative 50% to raise that a little bit on the y-axis. We'll give our bar a height of 4 pixels so that it actually shows up. And then the width is going to be 100%. Reason being is that the inactive bar should always stretch all the way across. And the active bar, which is going to overlay directly on top of that, will begin to increment at 25, 50%, 75%, 100%. The z-index is also going to need to be set to -1 because we want that progress bar to be behind the numbers. So we're going to push it back along the z-axis. So if we save that and update that, we see we have something kind of coming into effect right here. So after the progress container before state, we'll go ahead and define the progress div. And that's going to be done as so. We'll give it a background color of the line border fill. We'll position it absolute. It's going to be almost perfectly in line with the other bar. Top is going to be 50%. Left is going to be 0. We'll transform and translate that along the y-axis by negative 50%. The height will be the same, 4 pixels. This is essentially going to lay right on top of the empty line. The width is going to be initially 0% because we are not going to have any initial progress, but that's going to be changed later with the scripting. And the z-index needs to go right behind the number, so we'll give it a -1 z-index. And then as it transitions, we want it to be a nice smooth transition. We don't want it to be snappy, so we want it to kind of be a nice gradual transition. So over the course of 0.4 seconds, we will ease in to that bar filling up. And so we see now we have a nice alignment here. The bar lines up perfectly with these numbers, if you can see. However, it is completely empty because the actual progress bar is set to a width of 0%. If we were to say set this to 75%, we'd give you an idea of what that would look like. 75% full right there. However, initially we do want it to be 0%. Okay, so now that we've defined the progress bar, let's go ahead and define the circles that the numbers are going to be in. So we'll access the circle, and we'll style this with a background color equal to the circle background color. We'll do a text color equal to the circle text color, like so. A border radius of 50% will give us a nice smooth circle, and a height and width of 30 pixels I think will be enough for us. Of course, feel free to change this and make it your own, but just for this project we'll stick with 30 and 30. Let's display this as flex so that it is nice and floaty in the center, and in doing that, of course, we always align center and justify content center. Okay, and then if we save that, we see we're kind of coming into fruition here. Let's go ahead and give it a border. The border is going to be 3 pixels thick. It's going to be a solid border, and the color of the border is going to be equal to the background of the line. So we'll do initially line border empty, and then we'll change that as the progress indicator fills up. And just like the progress line, we want the transition to be nice and easy, so 0.4 second ease of transition. And that takes care of the basic circle element, but now we need to define the circle active. So we'll access the circle active div, and we'll style this with a border color equal to the line border when it's fill, just like so. And so you see the first one has now lit up because the first one is always active. Let's go ahead and jump down here and we'll start to style the buttons. So the basic button styling is going to be a background color equal to the variable we've defined as the button background color, like so. The color of the text is going to be equal to the button text active. We're going to assume that they're active first, and then we'll change them to inactive if the case calls for it. Go ahead and take away the border, but we will give it a border radius to give it a nice smooth beveled edge. We'll do a 6 pixel border radius there, and we'll make the cursor a pointer. The font family should inherit the document font family, so we'll just do inherit right there, and then we'll do some padding. We'll do 8 pixels and 30 pixels there for the padding. That should be nice and styled. We'll give it a margin, not max resolution, let's make that margin of about 5 pixels. And then the font size, let's make that about 14. That should be nice and pretty. We'll save that, and it's starting to look like a very respectable web page content. So now we're going to define the button in its active state, which is going to be done by accessing the button element and active, like so. This is actually going to be pretty simple. It's going to be transform of a scale 0.98, and this is going to make it just different enough to pop when it's active. Next, the button in focus state is going to be outline of 0, and then we'll do button in its disabled state. Now here we're just going to give it the background color equal to the line border when it's empty. We're going to give it the text color equal to the button text color inactive. And then we're going to tell the cursor that it is not allowed. It is not a clickable button. So we'll save that, and we can see here now that since the first element is the only active element, the previous button has disabled itself and the cursor is not allowing us to click on it. However, the next one is free to be clicked on, but there's still no functionality because we have not begun the script.js yet. Now that's everything that we need in the style sheet. We can jump in here to the script.js and we can start to define the behaviors of this. So we need to define a couple of constants, and we're going to reference the document IDs, the document elements by their IDs that we've given them. So we'll do a constant that we'll call progress and set it equal to document, and we'll get element by ID, and since we've named it progress, that's what we're going to need to call it. We'll do one for the previous button, and we'll set it to document, get element by ID. We've named that one prev, and we'll do a constant next, and likewise document get element by ID, and we've called this one next, like so. Lastly, we need to do a constant that's going to be an array, and we're going to call this one circles, and we're going to do a document query select all, everything that has the element name of circle is going to go into this array so that we can then iterate through all of the circles in our document. Then we'll define a variable called current active. So whichever one is currently active, and we'll start with number 1, like so. Let current active equal 1. Let me spell that right. Let current active equal 1. Now we need to add the click listeners to our next and previous buttons. So let's do next.addEventListener. It's going to be a click listener. It's going to be set to the function of the following. This function is going to check to see if, first of all, if it's the last active circle, then we're going to need to disable the next button, and we will not be able to increment the current active variable. So if it's not current active greater than, and we'll use the circles array that we made, the length of that array, -1 as the determining factor, and we're going to do -1 because we want 4 to actually be selectable. Then we're going to increment it if that case proves to be true. After that, we're going to write a function in just a minute called update, but we want to make sure that every time we have a button click that we run an update function to change the styling. Next we'll do previous addEventListener, and just like the next button, it's going to be a click listener, and it's going to be equal to a function that does the following. Just like the next button, we need to make sure that if we're on the first active, that we are not able to decrement the active variable any further. So let's check if not current active is less than 1, then we'll allow it to decrement. And then we will also update. All right, so we're looking pretty good right now. Let's go ahead and write the update function that we've been calling. And the update function is simply going to restyle every time there's a button click. So in the update function, we'll access our circles array, and we'll iterate through for each one, and it's going to be for each circle element and its index position, do the following function, which is going to be if the position is less than whatever is currently active, then we're going to access the class list of the circle, and we're going to add the class of active. Now, if it's not, then we're going to do, likewise, access the class list, and we're going to remove the class of active, like so. Nice and tidy. Now, after that, we need to define a constant that we're going to call actives, and it's going to be an array of all the actives. And so since it's going to be an array, we're going to use the query select all, and this is going to be anything with the class of active. And now that we have an array of all of our active elements, we can then start to mess with our progress meter. So it's going to be progress.style, and we're changing the width because we want it to stretch across the progress bar. Now we're going to need to do a little bit of arithmetic because we have here 4 elements, but we're working with a percentage of width, and so we want to make sure that if it's on the 4th element that it's 100%, if it's on the first element that it's 0%, and then somewhere in between here it's going to need to be some division of those two. And so we're going to have the length of all of our actives, we're going to have the length of how many circles we have, and we're going to need to do some sort of division between the two, then multiply it by 100 so it turns it into a percentage, and then we're going to need to concatenate the percent sign so that the style document knows that what we're asking for is the width to be turned into a percentage. So the way we can do that is by calling actives.length, and we're going to subtract 1, and we're going to divide that by circles.length minus 1. We're going to multiply that by 100, and then we're going to concatenate the percentage sign. And so this tells the CSS document, take the total number of circles divided, or take the total number of active circles divided by the total number of circles, multiply it by 100 to get a percentage, and then go ahead and add that text percent sign so that you know that you're working with a percentage variable for the width. So that'll happen every time we run the update function, which is called every time we have a click listener. Now after that, we need to do a couple of checks. So let's check to see if the current active is equal to the first element, in which case we need to disable the previous button. And then else if current active is equal to, and we'll just use the length of the circles array. If it's equal to the last circle, then we're going to disable the next button. Lastly, in the case that neither one of those is true, we're going to let both buttons be active. So we're going to set disable to both to be false. All right, and that's nice and tidy. That looks like a good scripting document, and that should be good enough to make this work. So let's go ahead and see it in practice. So we have number 1 here, previous is disabled. If I click next, we have a nice smooth transition to number 2. Previous is now enabled, so I can go back to number 1, which it disables. Clicking next to 2, clicking next to 3, and then clicking next to 4 disables the next button, but the previous is still active. And so we can go back and forth. It's a nice, smooth little transition, a nice snazzy little web app content. And so hopefully this has been something that's going to be fun and entertaining, and hopefully you've all learned something. All of this code is going to be available in the GitHub, which is going to have a link in the description. Feel free to download that and edit it to your heart's content. And thank you so much for watching. We'll see everybody back again in the next video. Have a wonderful night.